we'll go ahead and do the two other topics we had talked about, and then, like I said, we'll follow that up with some more opportunity for conversation. So, yeah, thank you all for being here, being willing to talk. So this whole series today we're basing off of Psalm 32 and verse 9, which, while maybe not directly addressing what we're talking about, I think the sentiment is very true for a lot of situations. I was speechless and quiet. I kept silence, even from speaking good, and my pain intensified. And so the goal of this event, the goal of today, is to talk about it. For those who maybe weren't here this morning, with each of these lessons, presentations, we're going through a five-stage outline. First, talking about terms. When we talk about this, what are we talking about? From a more clinical perspective, what are symptoms? Is there some sort of biblical example that can connect to those symptoms? Some practical suggestions, and then a psalm that seems to touch on or be written maybe out of the experience that we're talking about. So this hour, we're going to look at dementia and addiction. If you have the handout, dementia would actually be the first page. So this will be presentation 1 and 4, if you're following with the handout. And like I said this morning, I want everybody's feedback. This is the first place that I have done this series. So I would welcome your feedback. There are other congregations already that have scheduled for me to come out or to talk to them about coming out. So, but I really appreciate you all kind of taking a risk in more than one way of doing this today. So, and we want to be sensitive and compassionate and realize that a lot of these issues are very real. It's not just a theoretical conversation, but it's a very real thing. And when I started having some conversations with people about this series, one of the things that came up was the need for talking about dementia symptoms within congregations. And that's why this got scheduled in, was actually a conversation with another congregation about the need for some lessons on dementia. One of the things that I didn't really anticipate when I started in my role as a chaplain at a psychiatry hospital is that there are a lot of patients there who have issues related to Alzheimer's and that sort of a thing. I guess I just in my mind had a different sort of image of psychiatry and of the mental health field. But there's a lot of what they call geropsych, geriatric psychiatry. I believe Jewish Hospital within U of L Health is where geropsych is. And a lot of that is dealing with older age onset conditions. So we haven't talked about this, it's sort of outside the scope of what we want to talk about, but there's certain conditions that tend to have more of an age onset. Typically, Alzheimer's disease, dementia symptoms are a late onset psychiatric issue. There are others that tend to be onset at differing ages in the lifespan. And another reason why I think it's helpful to talk about this is because most of us have had an experience, whether ourselves or someone we love and care for, of having dementia symptoms. And with that, I don't know of anybody who would say, well, that's not a real condition. That's not a real thing. We understand when encountering that this is very real, that there is something as the age has progressed that has impacted what's going on in the brain, and that has manifested itself as these symptoms. And there's very few people, if anybody, who would say, well, that's not a real thing. And I would encourage us to use that to think about the other issues that we're talking about. We would think it would be not very compassionate to tell someone in their 80s, that's not a real thing. And yet oftentimes people at younger ages are told whatever they're suffering with, well, that's that's not a real thing, or get over it, or whatever it might be. So I want to use that as sort of an illustration to then think broader. So hopefully that is helpful and makes sense. So with each of these, we've tried to define like terms and symptoms from a more sort of clinical perspective. So as far as diagnosis is concerned, the manual that's used to diagnose psychiatry, mental health, behavioral health, you'll hear those things kind of used interchangeably. It's considered a neurocognitive disorder, and that's an umbrella term under which other specific diseases are talked about. From a terms standpoint, dementia comes from the word demented. And I know when we first hear that, that may not sound like a very sensitive, compassionate sort of way to talk about it, because what that might conjure up for us. But with each of these, I've been trying to give the origin of where does the word come from? Where does it derive from? So dementia, it comes from the word for demented, having to do with the mind and something that's not working properly as far as a mental process. And so dementia is actually not a diagnosis, but it's a way of referring to symptoms of cognitive decline. In terms of the diagnosis, so these would all be, you might say, there's differing diseases with dementia symptoms. The most common of which is Alzheimer's disease. There's also what is known as vascular dementia. Sometimes the symptoms might come about due to a stroke or some sort of issue like that. Lesser percentage cases, there's frontotemporal dementia and then Lewy body dementia. So I know, at least for myself, there's been times where I've been kind of confused as to just terminology. How do you talk about this? What's the right wording to use? That sort of thing. But if you were to put it all in a sentence, it would be something like Alzheimer's disease is a specific neurocognitive disorder of a person experiencing a certain set of dementia symptoms. I don't expect us, myself included, to go out and use that sentence or even remember all of that per se, but maybe it's a helpful way of just sort of orienting ourselves to the language and clinically how it's talked about. As far as symptoms, there's usually memory loss, but with short-term memory. Long-term memory is often very much still there, and we'll talk about that a bit more as we go on. Communication difficulties in the moment of being able to say what is wanted to be said, maybe remembering, a name or a word, or, trying, it's like, it's there somewhere and you're trying to recall it, but you're just struggling to do that. So there could be some frustration around communication. Mood changes. It might be that there's an individual who at one point in time they were this way, and now that has, there's things going on that are very uncharacteristic of the person that you once knew. There can be apathy, just a lack of enjoyment of things, apathetic sort of outlook. When we think about biblical examples, are there any biblical examples of this? Earlier today when we were talking about depression, we talked about that. Anxiety, we talked about that. Well, what about this one? Well, certainly the word is never used because it's, you don't find the term Alzheimer's disease in the Bible. That's a modern day diagnosis, but is there anything that might resonate with it? And there are some people that have looked at this and they think that there might be a biblical narrative that expresses some understanding or awareness of this. And that's in 2 Samuel 19, 34 through 37. David basically has asked an individual to travel back home with him, come back with him. But Barzillai said to the king, "How long have I to live that I should go up with the king to Jerusalem? I am today 80 years old. Can I discern between the good and bad? Can your servant taste what I eat or what I drink? Can I hear any longer the voice of singing men and singing women? Why then should your servant be a further burden to my lord the king? Your servant will go a little way across the Jordan with the king. And why should the king repay me with such a reward? Please let your servant turn back again, that I may die in my own city, near the grave of my father and mother. And it goes on and says, why don't you take this person instead? But some have looked at the wording here. He says, I'm 80 years old. I don't want to be a burden to you. My senses are declining. My ability to discern things is declining. Some have looked at this and said, could this be some example and awareness of something like this? So I think it's at least an interesting thought. It's not as though declining in older years is a new thing. If nothing else, I think that's what we can see from that. And then there's other scriptures sprinkled out through the Bible that give that sense as well. It's probably the case today that people are living longer, which is raising rates of these issues. But there's evidence that this sort of thing has always existed, just like I would suggest that depression has always existed, even if ancient people or people in the times of the Bible didn't have the same language we have to talk about it. And so, similarly. What are some practical suggestions for the church from a kind of spiritual perspective dealing with these sort of issues? One, I would say to embrace familiarity. And what I have seen and come to realize is that because the long-term memory is still there, just in my own setting, although I don't work with a lot of Alzheimer's directly, but there might be situations where a person really is struggling to have any short-term memory at all, and yet they can still quote Psalm 23, or they can still sing Amazing Grace verse by verse, or they can still remember portions of Scripture that they've memorized, and embrace that. If we need to quote Psalm 23 10 times a day, then if possible, we can quote Psalm 23 10 times a day. If we need to sing Amazing Grace for the 5th time today, getting into that sort of a mode of thinking, I think is helpful. When Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount talks about not using vain repetitions in prayer, I think sometimes we are hesitant to then do the same thing multiple times because we think, well, what if that's a vain repetition? I don't think that's what Jesus is talking about. He's talking about something that's empty, something that has no real meaning to it. It is incredibly meaningful to that person in the moment to recite that again or to say that again. You might know that they just did that 5 minutes ago. For them, it might be a different experience. And so I would just encourage us to think about that sensitively and compassionately. Another suggestion is to embrace beauty. And by that, I mean to get more into the senses. What do you see? What do you smell? What can you hear? What can you taste? Hospitals will have a lot of therapies that are more sensory-based because as the brain's capability to process information may decline in a variety of cases, the sensory world is still very much there. People can still embrace beauty. And as I thought about that, I thought about Jesus' words when he says, look at the birds of the air, for they neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not of more value than they? And I realize that here Jesus is probably not speaking directly to people with these sort of issues, but it made me think, when does Jesus use the beauty in the sensory world to try to make some sort of a point? And I think he might do that more than what we maybe realize or think about sometimes. So embrace what is familiar, what is still there in the long-term memory. Embrace the moment, but through sensory experiences. So, for example, I was going to say something a minute ago. When hospitals have something like art therapy or music therapy or activity therapy, things like making bracelets or beads or clay or something like that, what that is doing is embracing the sensory world. It's not mental processing, if you will. It's not a real heady thing, but what it's doing is embracing the senses through trying to engage beauty and create beauty. And that not only for symptoms of dementia, but for a lot of other situations as well, that can be very, very helpful to get into the senses. And then a third suggestion is to embrace worship. I think there's something about worship that it embraces the familiar. We've sung a lot of these songs many times. We've read a lot of these verses many times. And yet it also ought to be embracing the beautiful. And I think there's something about worship that it ties together familiarity with beauty that can be very helpful, especially for those with a neurocognitive disorder. And then also thinking about the tactile, making things very tactile, I think, can be helpful. Picking up the Bible, turning the pages, touching the familiar pages of the songbook, tasting the Lord's Supper, all of these things that are very embodied type of things that I wonder sometimes in our quick embrace of all things technological, if we sort of remove the tactile, sensory world from worship. And I just think that's something to kind of wrestle with and think about a little bit. And then also caring for those who are in the caregiver role. I have not, both of my parents are here today. I know they themselves have gone through that with parents. I'm not in that stage yet. Maybe never will be, I don't know. But I have heard many stories of many people of the incredible difficulty and challenge of caring for the generation that's above them, taking care of grandparents, taking care of parents, things like that. And sometimes the caregiver is the most overlooked person in the scenario. And they have things that are weighing on them and weighing on them heavily. They are burdened with feelings of guilt and shame and wondering if they've done the right thing or if they're going to do the right thing or if they should do this or they should do that. And just so much that they've taken on that as the church, we should be aware of the person struggling with the symptoms, but then also those who are giving care to the person, because that can be a very heavy burden to bear. And we are to bear one another's burdens. So if we were to point to a psalm, that's the way we've concluded each of these. If we were to point to a psalm, I would point us to Psalm 71. And specifically verses 9 and then 17 and 18. Do not cast me off in the time of old age. Do not forsake me when my strength fails. Verse 17, O God, you have taught me from my youth, and to this day I declare your wondrous works. Now also when I am old and gray-headed, O God, do not forsake me until I declare your strength to just this generation, your power to everyone who is to come. And I don't believe there's anything in this psalm that is meant to make the caregiver feel any sort of sense of shame doing what they need to do to ensure a person is well taken care of. Rather, it seems like a prayer, and that's what I've tried to point us to with each of the Psalms, is some sort of a prayer of someone who maybe in one way or another is experiencing something like this, or is anticipating maybe the day when they might experience something